Hello, in this video we are going to talk about socialization. It is a key concept in all sociology classes because we have just recently learned about what culture is and how we have to learn culture and share culture with those around us, and that's how culture continues from one generation to the next. We learned all the different components of culture that sociologists and social scientists in general, anthropologists, geographers look at throughout the world when we study one society to the next. Culture changes from place to place, but one thing that does not change from place to place is the fact that human beings must learn to be a member of the social group that they are born into, adopted into, moved into in their lifetime. So, human beings are born doing a few things automatically, such as the need to eat and sleep and pee and poop, and you have reactions like cold or hot or sickness or need to scratch your nose or something, feelings of discomfort or otherwise. So human beings share those things in common with the animals. All of those basic animal needs were born with those functions, but everything else, how to satisfy the hunger or the proper way to go to the bathroom, or the different types of things that are expected around you when you need to go to sleep. Those kinds of things are specific to a culture, and we have to learn everything, not just those, but even the language that I'm using to communicate with you now. We had to learn that language in order for you to be able to read the captions, read the transcript, hear me speaking, however it is that you are consuming this information. You had to learn that process. And so all of it has to do with socialization, and that's what this first video this week is all about. So, socialization is learning how to behave, react, think, feel, even the emotional responses that we're supposed to have, the ideas that we come up with in our heads. In your textbook, it'll also say the conditions that we learn in our lives. Conditions like wealth versus poverty, able-bodiedness, disabled-bodiness, that kind of thing is learned. Our learning process happens whenever we have social interaction. And so social interaction happens throughout our entire lifetime. One thing that, as I look back on the board here, I emphasize the word lifetime at the end of this definition. Some sociologists put it at the beginning. They say a lifelong learning process, because lifelong, your entire lifetime, is a very key thing to remember about this learning process that we call socialization, because we have to constantly renegotiate the proper, here's my air quotes, proper behaviors, the proper way to react or think or feel about a certain thing. The behaviors that we learned from our birth until 5 years old that were just fine for us when we were 5, they got us along really well in our social situation when we were 5. Some of those behaviors might still be perfectly acceptable for you in your social condition now, but if you are 25 or 45 or 65 or however many decades added to that 5, there are different social expectations that society on the macro scale has for you, the individual. There are different social expectations that people within your daily life experience place on you. And some of the things that you liked to do when you were 5 might still be just fine for you to do when you're 35. But there are different social expectations that society on the macro scale and your immediate social group has for you when you're 35 that they would never have expected from you when you were 5 years old, 15 years old, for instance, and not supposed to do those things yet. Listen to the emphasis on those words that I place there, that if you're reading the captions or reading the transcript, you won't get that emphasis. But yeah, I'm supposed to. I don't know if that's a sarcastic tone or just emphasis on the word supposed to, right? Okay, So, when you are writing a definition of socialization, first I want you to compare this definition that I have on the board behind me with the definition that your textbook author includes in chapter 3. You should see some keywords. It's lifelong. There's a keyword, lifelong or your whole lifetime. However you put that concept, it doesn't matter as long as the concept is there. It's a learning process. It's lifelong. And the key thing that we need to see after those two concepts is that we learn through social interaction. And so I want to focus on this social interaction concept for a second, because you have to understand that unlike the animals and the traits that we share with the animals, human beings are constantly learning our social group, our social setting, from the moment that we are born. And sometimes some people suggest, some researchers, not just random people, but some researchers propose that even babies that are still in the womb can begin learning before they've even had their first breath of oxygen. Some people play specific types of music for unborn babies. Some people claim that when a baby is born, they've noticed, they've observed that when babies are born, often babies can recognize their mother's voice and differentiate it from other voices in the room. So there's a lot of speculation and therefore research into how much learning can actually happen before we take our first breath of oxygen. But in sociology, we concede that at least with that first breath of oxygen, we begin learning our social setting, how we fit into that social setting, how we interact with those in our social setting from our very first breath. And so there's some facts that you need to know about socialization, that the learning process that we go through in socialization is constant. And so this phrase or this sentence about socialization refers to the fact that it takes a lifetime. It's a lifelong process. There isn't a start time that we can definitely state, except for that we do say that at the first breath that we start at least at that time, but there's not a definite end time. Like you can't say the first 15 years of life, that's when your socialization process happens, because you're going to transition to a lot of different and new social experiences from 15 till whenever the end is. And so you're constantly learning how to negotiate those situations. Where do I fit in? How do I behave? How am I supposed to react? What conditions should I expect? What's my place here? Those kinds of things. We're constantly assessing those situations, and therefore the learning process about how to get by in our daily life is constant. Okay? So that's a fact about socialization. All right? Also, socialization happens in formal ways, but also very informal ways. So what you and I are doing right now is having a formal setting where I am intentionally giving you information that you are supposed to learn because you have signed up for this class, so you expect this organized structure, you expect the notes, you expect the assignments, you expect the tests, you expect these kinds of things. And this is part of your socialization process because you're getting this college degree so that you can go and do things with it in the future. Okay? And so definitely socialization, that learning process, any learning that goes on any time in your daily life experience is part of the socialization process. That would be considered the formal part of socialization. But socialization happens informally all the time. Outside of the organized structure of a classroom, any observation that you make, any TV show you see, any video game you participate in, any vlog that you follow, any sort of games that you play with your siblings or with your child, or activities that you do, even just with your dog in the yard, if you're just alone watching TV and having that kind of interaction, watching, Blue's Clues or Cocomelon or any of those kinds of things that little kids watch these days, the learning process is happening in an informal way rather than a formal way. So it's constant and it comes at us from all of those different directions. In another video that you'll watch during this week's set of lessons, we're going to talk about all those things that I just mentioned. Playing games, interacting with your animals, or being on YouTube watching a video, or interacting with your siblings. These kinds of things are all situations that happen in our life experiences on a daily, weekly basis, and therefore they are situations where socialization takes place. So we're going to look specifically at those things in another video, and they have a particular vocabulary word that correspond to them, so you'll have to wait for that, keep you in suspense for that one. But it's important to know all of these things about the socialization process, and I want to point out that what we learn doesn't necessarily follow the norms of society. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video that when we were talking about culture in recent weeks, we said that culture's learned, it's shared, it's passed from one generation to the next. Yes, that is true. In socialization, it is important to know that yes, if the people we are around on a daily basis, if those people follow the acceptable rules of social behavior, if those people follow the traditions and the customs of macro scale culture, if those individuals follow the norms and the values that are dominant in that culture, then you and I are going to learn those things too, and we're going to behave those ways as we move on through our lifetime. We're going to use that as like a foundational kind of measuring tool to gauge things against as we, and modify our behavior as we move into our adult life and are more in control of what our daily life experiences, behaviors, actions, feelings are. So I say this because not everybody, not every child, not every person within their cognitive development stages of life have the same examples set for them as each other. In some cases, our family, our peers, the people that we are around every day who create these life experiences for us, remember, we learn in those informal settings. It's sometimes more powerful than the stuff you're going to learn in your formal settings, those informal messages that we get just from daily interaction. If the people who we were born to, who are our guardians, who adopted us, etc., whoever those people are when we are in our foundational years of learning from them, if they don't follow the acceptable side of norms in society, if they don't observe overall society customs and traditions, if they don't behave on the acceptable side of norms in society, but instead they behave according to the unacceptable side of norms in society, then what are you and I going to learn if we're that little kid in that situation? We're going to learn what we see every day. We are not born with some kind of gauge or meter inside of us that tells us, warning, warning, this is not socially acceptable behavior, outside this immediate social context. This is not how you are supposed to behave in school, or how you're supposed to behave in the workplace, or how you're supposed to behave, etc. And so little kids can't know these things by themselves. They pick up messages from the interactions that they have on a regular basis. They pick up messages about how to behave. And so, if you and I are born to people who they make meth, for instance, as their source of income. And so you're around that every day and you see it every day. Not only will you learn how to do it, but you also won't know, there's nothing inside your body or inside your mind or soul that's going to tell you this is wrong. There is nothing like that unless you've had a reference to compare it to. And so you won't necessarily learn that what mama and papa do is not acceptable, right? You will just be around it every single day. And so, for instance, a former student of mine told me, shared with the whole class when we were talking about this in a face-to-face class, that he came from a Central American country when he was in his preteen years, and in his country of origin, one of the things that they did as a family, like as in his mind, it was like a wholesome family activity, was cockfighting. Well, cockfighting is not allowed in the United States. Not only is it illegal and can get you in trouble, but it's one of those illegal things that pretty much a whole lot of folks in our society find it morally wrong to do these kinds of things. So when you're looking at the types of norms that exist in society, it's not just a folk way for us. It was a folk way for my former student where he was from originally. This was just something to do on Fridays and Saturdays, as a family group. It wasn't considered serious at all. It certainly wasn't a violation of law. But in the United States, not only is it a violation of law, but when people do it, we sometimes would question, well, what is, quote, wrong with that person to think that this kind of thing is okay? So you see, that's why when you see this definition of socialization, you've got to talk about like learning how to think. What are you supposed to think like? What attitudes are you supposed to have? What kind of feelings is this kind of situation supposed to elicit in you? And so these different things are different from one place to the next. Culture is different from one place to the next, and we have to constantly remember that so we're not ethnocentric. But we also have to know that because we begin learning from the time we take our first breath, we will learn what's around us every day, and we will think that what's around us every day is perfectly acceptable. Because for that immediate social group, it must be perfectly acceptable, or you wouldn't see it all the time. So we learn not necessarily the norms of society, but the behaviors that are necessary to get by in that particular social context. And therefore, it is not correct in a sociological definition of socialization to say that it's a learning process where we learn our culture. Not necessarily. You might be born into or adopted into U.S. culture, but you won't learn U.S. culture unless it's modeled for you either through your immediate family members, the peers around you, the media that you take in, the books, the education system perhaps gives you, a reference for larger society than you could possibly have within your own family units, that kind of thing. So this is a complex topic. It's got macro scale components and micro scale components. Social interaction and social life experience happens on our micro scale, but the socialization process in general is a process that everybody everywhere, regardless of what your cultural makeup is, everybody everywhere goes through a socialization process to learn how to be, to think, to feel, to act. And so based on your social structure, there might be different components. Like I mentioned the education system a minute ago, there might not be a formal education system mandated by the federal government like we have in our country. In other countries around the world, they don't have that, regulated kind of organized way of designing the education system. There might be little pockets of, different types of community education, but not in the national oversight way that we do it in the United States. So we have to be open-minded. We have to understand why we need to word this definition of sociology very generally. Definition of socialization very generally, so that it includes everything, the informal and the formal situation, the fact that it's constant, and that not everybody learns what is normal or socially acceptable necessarily, because if the people around us don't do what is normal or socially acceptable, we're just going to learn from them without any sanctions from them, and therefore we might not be seen as quote unquote normal in larger society when we transition from one age to the next and venture out on our own. We might have aspects of our behavior that on a social level is weird, odd, unacceptable, any of those words that have to do with whatever norms are in our society, and how we, gauge people's behavior with that tool of what's acceptable or what's not acceptable. Those social rules called norms. Okay, so in our next videos that we're going to watch, not only are you going to learn about those agents of socialization, I didn't give you that term a minute ago, but that's one of the videos we're going to have, is the agents of socialization. Who creates the life experiences for us that makes learning happen. But also we're going to talk about unfortunate cases where people did not go through the expected socialization process, and they were either very, very far behind that they couldn't participate in human society by the time they were rescued or rehabilitated, or they had very different life expectancies and life outcomes in general because they were deprived of a socialization process for maybe very abusive reasons in some cases. And so we'll talk about that, and a growing debate about whether society has, how significant is society's role in the socialization process, or is it about biology and the fact that we have a human organized brain in our heads, and that's why we behave differently than animals. So there's a whole lot of debate about this, and so you'll see that in future videos. And also psychological development. So, we claim in sociology that learning begins at the first breath. And so for any of you who have interacted with little bitty newborns, it doesn't seem like they're learning much, but your brain is constantly developing, just like your skeleton has to grow larger so that you're taller and independent. You have to learn how to walk. You have to learn how to think too. And so we in sociology have to look at least into the cognitive development side of developmental psychology so that we can understand what types of things little bitty ones can learn when they are part of their social group and interacting with those significant others in their social groups. So I will see you in those videos. Text me with questions.